Welcome to Season 3 of Everything is Learning,
the podcast where we question, explore, and learn on purpose.
We're here to rethink and discover what's possible because learning never stops, and neither do we.
Let's dive in.
Hi, everybody. Season 3 is here, and we're adding a little magic to the mix. Along our adventure, we've met some truly fantastic people, and now it's time for you to meet another one of our guests. All right, folks, get ready to rethink everything you know about service, particularly in higher education. Today, we're joined by a dynamic educator, thought leader, and co-author of Elevating Customer Service in Higher Education, a true expert in transforming the student experience. With over 30 years as a senior leader and trainer, he's helped professionals across 20 states and beyond create game-changing service excellence programs that boost retention, engagement, and success. He's not just an expert. He's a faculty member, researcher, chef, and Disney aficionado who knows how to make learning both powerful and fun. And we should know because he was our professor. Buckle up for an eye-opening conversation that will change the way you see customer service in higher ed. Welcome, Dr. Heath. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So great to have you. Definitely top notch because it's nice to see how it kind of comes full circle. So we had you in a classroom and now we're getting to hone in on you ask the questions. It's now our turn to ask you some questions.
Yeah.
And to get us started and to know you a little better. The icebreaker question we'd like to kick off with is, if higher education were a theme park, what would be its biggest attraction and where would the longest line be?
That is a great question. And you both know I love theme parks, especially Disney theme parks. So I think now, given everything that's happening in the country and the world, I think definitely higher ed is on a roller coaster. So it would definitely be a roller coaster. So many schools are trying to figure out every new thing that's coming from the White House and others. So definitely a roller coaster. Which roller coaster, though? I'd like to say, I think oftentimes colleges and universities lean toward tradition and what's traditional. So when we think of Disney World, we might think of, Space Mountain. Everyone's going to go to Space Mountain. But I would offer that instead, universities need to be a little bit more innovative and think differently. So whereas Space Mountain used to be a fan favorite, now it's probably Guardians of the Galaxy in Epcot. It's new, it's different, the lines are always really long. And I think for higher ed, that's where we would want to be, in the new and innovative space, because we're going to have to be innovating to change or to act with all of the changes that are happening now.
Yeah,
absolutely. Was it worth the long line?
I hope it will be worth the long line.
Oh, you haven't? Oh,
Guardians of the Galaxy? Oh, yeah. Oh, my gosh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I've not been back to go on that one, so now I'm really intrigued.
Oh, it's amazing. I will warn you, though, kind of like going to college, though, sometimes it makes people a little bit sick.
It was funny when you were choosing a roller coaster, I would have chosen, with everything coming out of the White House right now with education, the teacups just spinning around. So also make you sick. Some people.
Yeah.
Totally. Totally.
Well, you talked about your passion for theme parks, which we loved when you brought into our classroom. But where did you fall in love, or how did you fall in love with service?
So at a theme park. It literally, I remember walking around Disney World with my family. And, for anyone who's been there, it just feels magical, right? It's just a magical time, a magical experience. Everything is happy. Adults are skipping and, all these things. And I remember thinking, if I could harness, or we in higher ed could harness just a little bit of that magic and bring it to campus, I really bet that we could transform the student experience. So that sort of got me thinking about higher ed and customer service, and the realization that higher ed still is not known for its customer service. So, if I were to ask you, name some top customer service organizations, you might say Starbucks or Amazon or, Disney, a number of things. People rarely, if ever, say, oh, the university I went to was really known for customer service. So that's how it started. And I started researching more on strategies and, reading more about customer service and the theories involved, and then actually applying them to higher education, which is some of the stuff that I did in the courses that you took.
Absolutely. Agreed. Out of curiosity, do you think since you started bringing this to higher ed professionals and institutions, have you noticed any shifts or changes where there are institutions doing this well?
Yeah, there are a few who do it really well. My goal is that in the next 5 to 10 years, people will start to say, oh, my university did it really, really well. But there's a few schools. Coastal Carolina University does it really well. That's in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. High Point University in North Carolina is known as kind of their concierge type model. And Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, are all really known for having high service standards.
It doesn't help that the weather's good in all those locations. I like it.
Right?
Right. No, thank you for that. And so your expertise is in service excellence. And I just would like to have a baseline for our listeners. Can you help qualify or quantify what exactly you're talking about when you talk about service excellence?
Yeah, service excellence really is a fancy word or fancy title for customer service. And, I think we started to use service excellence because so many in higher ed resist talking about customer service. They don't like the concept. That's something that I think is slowly changing. But service excellence really is customer service. Also, sometimes I couch it in the term of culture of care.
Oh, I love that. Culture of care.
Accessible. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's what you taught us. I think you taught us accessibility. Like, I think there tends to be a disconnect between you hear customer service and you immediately think of, well, I guess maybe I'll pitch that to you. When you think of customer service, what do you both immediately think of? I don't know. I mean, I do. But.
Well, I think the struggle is that oftentimes when people hear customer service, they think the customer is always right. And that actually is why so many, especially in higher ed, don't like the concept, because the customer isn't always right. And especially in higher ed and healthcare and other organizations, we know the customer isn't always right, but we still have this mantra in our head, which is why some people resist it. And that's one of the biggest arguments that I have to dispel when I go to a campus. Like, nope, it doesn't mean that we're, giving out grades like they're Tic Tacs.
Right. That's so interesting. You must have reprogrammed our brains, because that's what I would have thought. When I think of that, I do think of organizations, particularly RIT, because I do think the student experience there was exceptional. But I also think of I do think of shopping. I think of going to Wegmans, or I think of Disney. I think of, when I think of online, I think of Zappos. But I personally, when I hear customer service, don't really think of education. When I do think of education and I do connect customer service, I connect it with personalized learning. And I think that needs to be the big shift that should be coming here soon. And I think a lot of people are resistant because they think that's also not attainable for other reasons.
Right.
But Marissa, what do you think when you hear customer service?
Yeah. So as you were positing that, I thought about transactionality, or that everything is transactional. And I also would, for me, when I hear customer service and try and link it into higher ed, and this is just because of my personal background, I don't know that everyone would make this assumption. I hear customer service or service excellence and how it plays in a role in higher ed. And I really think it falls in the student affairs realm when it really should be pervasive across all experiences. And I think like for us, the fact that you brought it into the classroom where not everyone has that exposure was really helpful and powerful and impactful, because ultimately I often feel faculty, and this has been from my experience both working at a higher ed institution and then attending a higher ed institution, it feels like faculty push it to other professionals, like people not in the classroom. And I think it was so refreshing that that changed for us and our experience. And you did that. So thank you.
Well, I'm so glad. And, and I really believe that, right? Like it has to be everybody because, students experience and are exposed to so many people at a university and they don't get all their needs met by student affairs, right? They have to have their needs met through finance and administration, who may run dining and clean their residence halls, and, academic affairs, where their deans sit and their faculty sit. So, it's got to be everywhere. It can't just be one person or one division.
Right.
Especially because some students don't even touch student affairs, at least not in the conventional sense. Like some people might not live on campus. So how do you help commuter students or online students? And then, so everything that you said really resonates true. I think the reason that it's so easy to divert is because some people spend their daily work experience living in how can I make the student experience better? And it should be everyone doing that. And I will say, in my experience, I agree with Elena, RIT, which stands for Rochester Institute of Technology. They did it great. And what you're talking about in service excellence, I'm curious to see. There is a whole Magic Spell Studios. So gamification, that was something that came up in our coursework. Where does service excellence and gamification meet and how are they different? Because I don't want people to take away, oh, gamification, like making things fun, is service excellence. That's not it. That's synonymous.
No, it's not it. I think it's part of the equation. I think college should be fun. But again, it goes back to it's not all unicorns and rainbows, right?
Right.
But what I think it is when things are hard or when a student is struggling, that's where it matters the most, right?
Yeah.
And that's where the student needs to know where to go, who to seek out in order to get whatever their need is, in order to get their need met. And, I think that, again, I had someone at RIT actually said, oh, well, what are we going to do? Put a lazy river on campus? And I said, we have a lazy river on campus, right? Like there is a lazy river next to the pool. And, so we have that. We have that, right? There are still some students who are not happy with the student experience. So, just throwing things at students will not solve the problem. It's, to your points, the overall ethos of care that really, really will matter.
So how do you help universities that are online only? How does that work? Like, what does customer service look like? You were talking, especially when it comes to how can you even tell sometimes when a learner who, let's say, is not a self-advocate, how do you make sure they don't get lost in their education? And how do you make sure that you can still provide customer service to everyone who is in an online program?
Yeah, well, I think that that's a great question. And I think that online, it's even more important than in person, because when I'm on a college campus, there's so many things to look at, right? There's so many things to experience. When I'm sitting at my desk, like I am now, and I'm looking at a computer screen and I'm looking at a website and trying to figure out a learning management platform or something like that, and I can't get on, I really need customer service, right? Because I can't go to an office. I need a really apparent mechanism, whether it's through chat or contact or whatever it is, to say, how can this institution help solve your problem? And, we can even think of that in other areas. And if you've never tried to reach customer service at Amazon, that is one way that Amazon does not do customer service well, because they hide it, because they don't want us to contact them, right? Just
Right.
think about how many inquiries they would get. So they hide it. But if I'm an online institution, if I'm an online university, I don't want to hide that, right? I've got to have, help is here, contact me now. It's got to be really readily available, because there isn't a physical place that I can go.
Right. Do you think that you can be an online institution and still have great customer service that's not just like an experience, I guess? Not just that customer service is transactional, like we were talking about, but are there online institutions that have great programs that like offer more than just the transactional piece of education?
I think so, and I'll say for many, many years, for over a decade, I actually taught at the University of Phoenix online. And, I will say I am still to this day in touch with some of my students on Facebook and, connected with them, and they'll send me messages. And so I do think that it's possible. I think it might be a little more person specific, maybe versus like a school, because in many cases, like for Phoenix, sometimes the only time a student actually visited the school, a physical location, was at graduation.
Oh,
Nice that they
okay.
even offer that for folks.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
And I would say part of service excellence, because it's a true testament or a ceremony to mark all of that hard work.
That's
nice
right.
that is actualized. Given that we've been talking about service excellence, and whether online or physical, it's often seen as a nice to have rather than a necessity. So can you think of a powerful example where great service directly impacted student success or retention?
Yeah, that's really a good question. I think the issue is institutions who just want to kind of move students on their way, right? And, you go to a certain office and you have a question and you get your question answered and you kind of get next and move to the next. And, I think that efficiency is not service excellence in my mind. It is something that people do because they think that that's what the customer, especially students, want, where in most cases, what students and customers want is they want to be heard, right? They want you just to, I'm coming to you with a problem, but really I just need to vent, or I need to share this. And, I think that's something that colleges and universities miss. I think that they don't think about those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Really good point. I actually was thinking about it from the lens of so scrolling through TikTok or Instagram or Facebook, right? You sort of see these funny clips or videos of men who want a woman to just listen to them talk. Like they can't necessarily say all of this to their partner or spouse. And so they hire someone to just win an argument, right? And it's just because they want to feel heard. And the reverse is true too. Oh, I can't say this to someone without them feeling personally attacked. I just need someone to listen to. And actually, that's one of the recommendations in therapy that I have done is when you preface or start off a conversation with a person, are they looking for a solution or are they looking for you to listen? And starting off with that in mind. And I'm thinking about my own experience in the spaces where I felt best and most comfortable. And it was with people who would just hear me out. So that's a really great point.
And those are the people that you went back to over and over again,
For
right?
sure.
And I think on a campus that's also true. Students will tell you well, I have a person, or if they're lucky, they have a few people, right? But people that they know they can always go to get whatever they need. Sometimes it might be a question about anything. Students would come to me with every kind of question, right? And it was my responsibility because they were in front of me. It was my responsibility to help them find a solution, even if I wasn't part of the solution.
Yeah. This seems like a good time to shout out a couple of our favorite educators or learning mentors. So, Dr. Heath, did you have anybody who really changed the trajectory of your learning journey or experience, or even your experience in higher ed?
I think, for me, and I was just talking about this last week, I was very fortunate to have wonderful mentors and role models at my institution, both as faculty members and outside of faculty. So both student affairs folks and people in the classroom. So I was very fortunate. And I think they were really good role models, right? Because they showed me, how personal can you get with a student? Where are the boundaries? All of those things. And that was very powerful to me. And that's how I've lived my career.
Yeah. Marissa, do you have anybody who comes to mind in this conversation?
So, I have to give it up not only to Dr. Heath for being here, because we're true testaments to what you were talking about, how you've had students reach out even afterward. There were quite a few. I actually want to shout out Ann Zachmeyer, who was...
That was going to be mine!
Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
That's pretty pivotal to my success and figuring out what path was right for me to get through my master's. I had many mentors at John Carroll, and then even in elementary school, we talk about beloved teachers starting from kindergarten with Miss Fitzgerald and third grade with Miss Rosica and then Miss Fox and so on and so forth. But non-traditionally and more pop culture-y, Ted Lasso has been really impactful for me. And I recently had the best news ever where Ted Lasso is coming out with the season 4. And I cannot wait.
Yeah.
But yeah, Lane, who are some for you? Sorry, I stole yours.
No, you know what? I was just thinking at RIT, it was Dr. Heath, it was Dr. Modich, it was Ann Zachmeyer. I was thinking of Howard Ward. I felt like we could go to him with anything and it didn't matter what it was and he would help. Carla Delella, she was wonderful. Yeah, I gotta
give it out. You have to give it up to Dr. Jacobs. He was probably one of the most frustrating professors I've ever had, but he got the most out of me because he wouldn't just, to your point earlier, Dr. Heath, the customer isn't always right. And I would ask a question expecting a concrete answer. And that man, talk about a Socratic method, talk about unconventional teaching. I learned so much. And I know that he was really challenging for a lot of people, myself included.
I felt wrong all the time. And I felt wronged by him all the time. But I loved him.
Yeah, he really was. I think that's right. And, but again, that's a really good example. Jim Jacobs is a really good example of you didn't get what you wanted, but he's still on your list, right?
Sure.
So the customer is not always right, And Marissa, I remember having you in class. You have a lot of questions, right? And
thank you for resonating that. We've talked about my level of curiosity.
Yeah, we have.
And, sometimes there's a place to answer them and sometimes there's a place to have you sit with them and then move on. So I think that's really important. And, I think in terms of, people, especially at RIT, Carol Reed is known. I think she's infamous in terms of the customer service that she delivered. And she would always go the extra mile for really anyone who was in front of her, she would go the extra mile. And I think that's what it's all about.
That's really cool. Shout out, Mom. We love you. We love our mom. Yeah, it's one that's super kind. Two, I think Marissa and I are really fortunate because we also had grown up in higher ed in a really weird way, in an odd way, because she worked at RIT for so long. And then we worked in housing operations. And then we saw the campus actually grow as we were growing up, which was really cool and fascinating. And I don't think a lot of people get that experience. We actually saw buildings being made, a lot of them. And when you
the shed.
Yeah, the shed. It was just really interesting. And we went to camp there and all that stuff. But all to say, going back to customer centricity, I think the reason we feel so passionately as RIT Tigers is because as they were building the campus, they always thought of, I feel like, and we weren't in the rooms, where it happened. But now I'm going to play Hamilton in my head the whole time I'm talking. But it sounded like in the conversations when we did hear things that the customer was part of every single piece as it was being built. And I'm sure it wasn't always the case, but as young children, as preteens, as teens, as young adults, and Marissa and I didn't go there for our undergrad either. We went for our master's. Right. So like to see the evolution of something like that happen and see higher education change over a 30-year period of time, it's been really interesting to see that evolution, particularly in this one institution, but to also see customer centricity evolve too over time. And I wouldn't say it's perfect, but I do think that it's really interesting to have been on a couple different sides of it. Yeah. And how long were you at RIT altogether? And when did customer centricity kind of become a thing there?
So I was there for 17 years.
Okay.
And I'm going to say, I think customer centricity really started with the Senior Vice President for Student Affairs, Mary Beth Cooper, who was there. She was there a few years before I got there. And when she got there, she started to have conversations with people about students mattering and how students matter. And I remember when I got there, students would talk about their RIT experience as being the grind, right? Like it was quarter system. It was really fast. It was kind of like churn and burn, get them in, get them out, and get them going. And Dr. Cooper was really instrumental in saying, no, it's not about churn and burn. It is about every student matters and what is the experience. And, I always used to say, at RIT as a relatively new institution had about 3 traditions. And we needed to nurture them because we wanted them to sustain throughout the campus experience for years to come especially when students become alum, we want them to remember the traditions on campus. So, I think I really saw some movement during my time, but I think there was some movement even before that. Like I remember, your mom telling about when they renovated the residence halls and doing that. She always had students in mind when doing that. And, I think that, especially at RIT at that time, like many institutions, I don't think that was always the case. So it was really, really important. But now students talk about their RIT experience as they don't want to go anywhere else. They love it, and that's the goal. That's what we work so hard for.
Yeah. I think the thing that transformed me when it came to thinking about service excellence was if Disney ran your hospital, that book that you had assigned to us.
Yep.
First off, I remember Marissa and I being like, did you see this on the list? Like, is this what? Why are we learning about a hospital?
Well, but it was so exciting to read something so non-conventional and not like this hardcover textbook that I was going to have to lug around. And it was like really interesting to me. So I was eager to learn and read it. Anyway, yes, please continue, Elena.
I was like, how is this going to connect and be relatable at all? Like hospitals are awful and like people pass away there and we have terrible experiences when you're in the hospital. And Disney is this place of light and now it's going to become darkness. And then we read it and it was mind blowing. So like, what other books? Well, first off, what was your favorite part of teaching that book? And then second, what other books would you recommend for mastering service excellence and how you can apply Disney's customer centricity to our everyday lives?
Yeah. So I think for me in teaching that book, one, it really allowed me to grab, because the author does this, to grab concepts of Disney and show people how those concepts do apply to other disciplines and, in our case, higher ed. So I still am a fan of that book. I think another book that I really like it's called The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath. Heath, and no relation, obviously. And they talk about creating moments that matter and that will create lasting impact. And I think that that's really something for all of us to emulate every day. So, how and when can we create a memorable moment through our interactions with each other? So I think sometimes we don't know what those memorable moments are, right? Like there were things, I was just teaching a class and clearly there were things that I did that resonated with both of you. And you're like, oh, I might want to keep this guy around a little bit. But I don't know what they are, but there were moments. And, I think that that's really important. We don't know the power of any given moment when we're interacting with someone.
I can actually think of one that probably doesn't. I don't even know if you'll remember this, but we were talking about in the class, customers not always right. Our students really wanted Steve Aoki to come to campus to do a performance. And you were talking about how you had to do some risk management there. And because he would crowd surf and throw cake and, people could get hurt and
in an inflatable
That
boat.
was what it was. Yeah.
and I was like, I wouldn't have even thought about. All I hear is, oh, how fun that would be. And yes, how great, because we'll get all these students there. And he was the hot moment, right? It just really resonated with me about how the behind the scenes and what isn't seen.
Yeah.
What really plays a role in factoring that decision. And the other thing you left me with was no one wants to say no. How can we make your vision happen? But that's in a way that works mutually beneficial for both of us. And I think you also talked about earlier that people want to be heard and the churn and the grind that was happening. If you look from a business standpoint, efficiency matters. That's where the ROI is. That's where the metrics are.
Yeah.
But that isn't the takeaway that a student, if you actually talk to the customer, there are some that matters, maybe for parents making or guardians making a decision about if I'm paying for my child's tuition, I want to know that they're going to graduate, right? But from somebody who's actually in it, what really does it matter? Because that person is who is going to keep the tuition dollars coming in. And since the reality is money talks, how can we master the money talking with the experience everyone wants? And I really appreciate that when you think about service excellence, because I'm not in higher ed anymore, and we do monthly metrics and lean practices and Six Sigma and all the ways to make things safe and efficient, but not really with the service in mind. And I understand and appreciate that when I feel like my needs are met through good service, that's the lasting impact. And now companies talk about word of mouth and why that's so powerful. And impactful.
Sure. Yeah.
And I wish just more people thought of this as a necessity and not a nice to have.
Yeah, I agree. And, there's so much in there that you talked about. And, you mentioned, even safety. And safety is often coupled with customer service, because if guests or customers don't feel safe, they won't feel as though they've received good service. And, if we think about saying no, think about if we were at Disney World or really any theme park, think about the number of times that they have to say no to guests every day, right? All day, every day. It's how they say no, and it's why they say no. You need to put those bars down, because if not, you're going to get hurt and you might hurt someone else. So again, it goes back to safety, which is just really, it's crucial. And at a university especially, that was always my priority, right? No, Steve Aoki, you are not going to crowd surf in an inflatable raft or throw birthday cake into the crowd, because I'm envisioning you're going to throw cake. It's going to be all over the floor. People are going to slip. They're going to fall. They're going to break hips. They're going to do all those things, So customer service is also anticipating what could happen, even when the potential customer isn't thinking about that at all.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
It's just so interesting that as you're talking about this, and we've talked about cross-discipline and stuff, the conversation that I feel like you were just having, Dr. Heath, was the conversation that I feel like I was having with my toddlers earlier. So just so so interesting that I feel like it really, I never thought about myself as a mother with service excellence. So I'm going to do that from now on. I need to be assessing service excellence with my children. But the reality is, when I say no, we've taught our kids, we only say no when it's a safety thing. And it actually really works. And I specifically remember the Steve Aoki conversation too. But I think what you hit on the head was how important safety is to service excellence, because I know personally, having worked in high schools and middle schools in the last 15 years, that the transition to college seems to be really, that period of time seems to be a critical time in the mental health of young adults.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like there is enough service excellence in the transition area. What are ways that higher education institutions can be managing that? Because the statistics on suicide in particular is astounding in that transition year from senior year of high school to freshman year of college.
Yeah. Well, I think schools are learning this, but, I think just like we grow up with the customer's always right, many of us grow up with the golden rule. And the concept of the golden rule is, do unto others as they would do unto you, right? So I'm going to treat you the way I want to be treated. And I think, to your point, when a student is coming into a new school, all of their experiences are very different, right? So we have first generation college students. We have, students who have family responsibilities at home. We have students who have to work 3 jobs. We have a number of things. And I can't treat you with the golden rule. I can't treat you the way I want to be treated, because that's not going to fit, right? I need to treat you the way you want to be treated. And that actually is the platinum rule. And the platinum rule, I think, gets to your point about sort of a personalized education plan, right? In that it doesn't mean that everything in my education is going to be bespoke to me, but it means that things are going to be tailored to me and based on my needs. And I think so often we get in the habit of, you think about an orientation program like at RIT, thousands of students, how do you connect with all of them? You can't connect with all of them, but you've got to create an experience that meets what their needs are. And, what that means is, if I'm presenting or sharing some information on counseling services, if that's something that I think I need, I'm going to pay a little bit more attention to that. So it's about sharing all the offerings and then letting students pick and choose what they hear, because they're not going to hear all of it. When I did orientation for a long time, and, we were the number one office for offices to say, hey, can I come and talk to the first year students? No, you cannot come and talk to the first year students, because if I had everyone on the campus talk to the first year students, they would have a miserable time. There would be a bunch of talking heads and they wouldn't hear half of it, right? So we had to find ways to get them information that they could access without overwhelming them. And I think that's really what customer service and service excellence is about.
That's so great that you said that, because I've been studying or taking these quality modules. And one of the things was talked about not overburdening your customer. You definitely want transparency and using empathic design and some of those other key things. But it's just as critical what you don't say or don't put out as what you do say. And since I have a child who's on the autism spectrum, using plain or simple language, and the fact that that has become a norm or a standard, I would have said government-wide. I'm not quite clear what is being retained and what isn't, but the plain language being the most simple, direct, and easiest to communicate, that everything that you just said really resonated, as well as in your book that you co-authored, The Elevating Customer Service in Higher Education, you touch on the point of scripting for consistency, which is a critical message. It like reduces the chaos, reduces the background noise, and like make sure that everyone gets a consistent information. No one has a piece of this that someone else doesn't. At the same time, when you're talking about that tailored personalization, what to you is the trigger or the threshold point that would shift a conversation from the script to that personalized approach?
Yeah. So when you go off script,
Yeah.
I think it all has to come from what the customer needs. I think it also has to come from the way the customer is presenting themselves when they're in front of you. So, if I'll use a student, or it actually doesn't matter. It could be faculty, staff, student. If I was working on a campus and somebody would come into my office and they were agitated, their voice was a little loud, I sort of got the sense that they were coming in hot, I would treat them a little bit differently and probably go off the script a little bit more to double check with them to say, hey, can I get you some water? Do you want to have a seat in my office? Or maybe we'll go over here in the lounge and we'll chat about this. Wow, it looks like you've had a rough day, right? So things that may not be in the script, but things that are really important to set up that interaction. And, I've seen scripts. I have an example. Sometimes I share that, I was buying a ticket online for Disney World. I was part of a professional association and we got a group rate on a ticket because we were doing a program actually in the Magic Kingdom. And I tried for an hour to purchase this ticket and it would not take my credit card. It would not, I had all this stuff. So, I said, okay, I'm going to have to call. So I called and the guy that I got on the phone just stuck to a script, even though I started the conversation by saying, hey, Steve, I'm just letting you know that I've spent the last hour trying to buy this ticket and I'm a little bit frustrated. And his response was, oh, well, I'm sorry to hear that. Have you ever been to Disney World before? Steve, I don't want you to ask me that question, even though I know it's on your script. I want you to empathize that you wasted an hour of my time, right, online, and I want this solved. So, I think that there's a little bit of emotional intelligence that has to be factored in when we have a script, and that tells us when we need to divert from the script.
So whose job is that in higher education to teach all of this? Service excellence, emotional intelligence,
I think it can be anybody, in some cases. I think where I've seen the most success is when people at the highest levels of the institution say that service excellence is a priority, right? So when the president of a school says service excellence is a priority, because we know that students have lots of choices, competition for higher ed is really strong, and they can go anywhere, and we want them to choose us, pick me, pick me. When a president says that, and then really shows that they value that, that's when the message is most powerful. Even at RIT, in my sphere of influence as an associate vice president in student affairs, I was really able, I think, to make an impact with especially some members of my team and the people I worked with. That didn't necessarily transfer to every aspect of student affairs or the university. So, it depends on where our influences are.
Yeah. I think that it's one of those things that makes education and learning tricky, is determining responsibility. And not only that, but also identifying training. Who trains higher education institutions with emotional intelligence, and who even values it enough to pay for that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I just think that's a huge problem. And I think particularly right now, one of the greatest parts about RIT, none of the three of us are deaf or hard of hearing, but that's what it's really known for. And I think that a really powerful piece of that is because it's a major piece of the identity, if not the greatest part of the identity of the institution. You have to be intrinsically motivated by service excellence, right?
Well, yeah, you have to be able to know that you're going to experience people who are different than you, and you might experience something that may even be uncomfortable. And actually, coincidentally, something that has transpired since you had me in class, I actually wear hearing aids now. I am hard of hearing.
Are you really?
Yeah, but what I think is interesting about that, to your point, is had I not worked at RIT with so many people who are deaf and hard of hearing, I think I would have been really more reluctant to get hearing aids or to get my hearing checked, because of the culture there. It was like, oh, it's an everyday aspect of life. But I think to your point, for both of you, it comes to who's responsible. And, really at an institution, everybody is responsible for providing good customer service. And yes, it helps if it comes from the president, but sometimes, I would hear people say, oh, well, that's above my pay grade. Nothing is above your pay grade, right? I hate that. Like, it is not above your pay grade. Do what you can do to make a difference within your sphere of influence. And it doesn't matter what your sphere of influence. If your sphere of influence is collecting the trash, if your sphere of influence is mowing the lawn, if your sphere of influence is managing the finances of the institution, whatever you can do to enhance the customer experience within that sphere is going to make a difference. And that's when this culture shift will happen more readily and not come just from one or two people.
Agreed. I mean, and you calling out the key point of leadership has to be on board and understanding that every employee or every person, frontline, whatever level, understands the overall goal of the institution, which for many is a mission statement or a vision statement. If everyone understands, adopts, utilizes their role to further advance that, then that's exactly what should be done. Like,
Yep.
yes, it might not fall under your job description, but the job description is a part of the wider institution, and the institution has set this precedent. And for me, I got to shout out Mr. Joseph Whaler, who was the principal of Notre Dame Cathedral Latin when I was a teacher. The mission statement was posted on the wall for every student to see, for every faculty member to see, for every staff member to see. It was hidden from no one, and he made it short and concise. He always spoke to the values of the school and the mission. And that is when I go, and if I'm job searching or if I'm trying to do better by my existing company, I look at what is it that we're trying to accomplish together and what can I do in my current position in addition to my job description to further that mission.
Yep.
And that's exactly how you build that ethos that you said. And so service excellence being a part of that is really going to carry an institution. I hope people start looking at that differently. But since we were talking about accessibility, so RIT is so unique in that it does have that community where ingrained, it's like almost instinctual. You're going to encounter people with differences. And I don't just think about differences from the lens of, or I should say abilities, from the lens of visible or invisible. And we talked about that in class too. The society word can be marginalized groups. So we're talking about, like, for me, my son is neurodivergent. So when we think about marginalized groups, neurodivergent, LGBTQIA plus students, any student that is part of a minority group encountering unique challenges in higher education, how can institutions create inclusive service models that prioritize these students' well-being with dignity and care?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I was saying about, not treating every customer the same. We should treat everyone with the same dignity and respect, to your point, but that doesn't mean that we give each customer the same thing. We all have unique needs. And, another way to think about it is think about customer service in all aspects of what we do. Like when we're writing a policy or procedure, are we writing it for the audience or are we writing it for, my benefit? Am I writing it for me because it's going to make my life easier? Or is it a student code of conduct that I need to write in language that a student will actually understand? Mm-hmm. So I think it's a variety of things, but I think it can't look at students especially or our customers as widgets. it's sort of like it's Burger King, right? It's have it your way. Maybe you want pickles, maybe you want lettuce, maybe you don't want onion. So I'm still going to give you a burger, but I'm going to modify that burger depending on what you specifically are looking for. And I think that that's the key.
Yeah.
I do think that there are institutions where they allow that flexibility, but there's also ones that stray to more tradition. So how do you emphasize that ability to be innovative when so many of the places that you've worked and collaborated with are based on tradition?
I think that, again, tradition is one thing, but just doing things because we've always done them that way is not tradition. That's just stale. That's just stale action, right?
Yes.
So we want to make sure that people are saying, oh, what do you mean you don't want onions on your burger? Oh, I actually will save money. I'm charging you the same, but if I don't put onions on your burger or 100 other burgers today, I'm going to save money in that. So I think it's being innovative in the way that we think about service. It's okay to think about service from what an institution is going to gain, what I'm going to gain from that. That's okay. And that's, mutually beneficial because we're both getting something out of that.
Yeah. You're teetering on this concept that we talk a lot about on the podcast, which is unlearning. So in our conversation, I think it is so key that people take away unlearning the golden rule. I don't really see where that fits in a lot of places in society anymore. I'm not saying that it doesn't have its place sometimes, but I do think unlearning the golden rule was one. There was another one you talked about that was something that people use all the time. Oh, it's above my pay grade. Unlearn that for service excellence. What's something else? What's something else that you've unlearned, or that is something that is traditional in the wrong sense that people should unlearn about service excellence?
I think it's the concept that efficiency is always best. There are certain places where I like efficient service, right? I like efficient service at the deli counter. I like efficient service when I'm in the McDonald's drive-thru. When I'm at the doctor's office, I don't necessarily want efficient service. Right. I don't want to be, okay, did you do this looks good. Okay, well, we'll see you in a year. That doesn't work for me. But the concept sometimes is, they got great service. It was really efficient. Efficiency doesn't equal value. Efficiency doesn't equal creating a real positive experience. Efficiency actually can achieve just the opposite. So I think that people should unlearn that efficiency is always best.
There are necessary non-value adds from a financial transactional standpoint, but that are clearly necessary. And that is a great one, right? So taking a little bit more time with the patient to make sure that all of their questions are answered.
Yep.
Absolutely makes a difference. I love that you said that. And that there are appropriate, it's not one size fits all for every industry.
Right.
But if you fall under that, or if what you would want from that experience, thinking about it from a lens of, I know we said the golden rule is out and the platinum rule is in, but even just empathizing from a standpoint of how would I want my experience in this situation? So a really good way to think about it. Thank you, Dr. Heath.
I think you talked about values in a really interesting way that got me thinking, what is a quick exercise that people can do to identify service excellence values for their institution? Is there a quick way, I guess? I don't know. But is there a practice you love to go to?
I think that there's a few things that I like. One is I can't tell you necessarily what the customer experience is. I have to let them tell me. Because again, my experience might be really good. And, especially with students, we would see students regularly who say, I went to faculty office hours and, they weren't there, or, I walked all the way over there and their door was closed or whatever else. So, I think we have to let the customer tell us. and guide us and lead us to what the best service is. We have to ask them. Customer service, especially in higher education, but anywhere really, is all about that communication flow. It's, you telling me what we've done really well and you telling me what we could improve upon. And I think that that's really important.
What's the best customer service you've ever received?
That is a really good question. Probably, of course, I've received good customer service at Disney. I have also received questionable customer service at Disney, like anywhere. But I had a particular doctor who offered me really, really good customer service. And after years and years of going to various service providers, finally said, you know what? We haven't tried this. Are you game to try this? And I was like, yeah, sure. Really changed my life. So, I think that is my example. And that is because the service provider listened and they weren't the expert. And I think that in customer service, that's often one of the challenges, right? Like, especially in higher ed, we're the experts. They can't tell us. Oh, no, they can tell us and they should tell us.
Marissa, can you answer that question too? Because it's interesting, Dr. Heath. My experience was with a person and that would have been my best customer service, was also health related. Marissa, what about you?
I feel like because it's so pronounced in my mind due to a recent experience, the trip to the hospital, we had to meet with a neurologist for my son, and she gave this incredible anecdote that made the condition that my son has so accessible. And it was about pots boiling on an oven, and that my son's threshold, or the water level, right? Like what leads to boiling over. And for a neurotypical person, the water level starts at a lot lower. So you need much more amount of time for it to boil over. Well, my son, his water level starts higher. And so medication that he was going to need would help even the playing field on the level. But that spoke to me about like why IEPs are important, or 504 plans, or why making things accessible, not necessarily equitable. Equal. Equitable, yes. Equal, no. Not making everything equal. So like not giving everyone the same thing, but equitable and accessible. Why that really mattered. No one had put it quite well enough for me to actually visualize. And that was so impactful for me. But that is really recent. I think other than that, like I love Wegmans iced shortbread cookies. It has been such a pain point that I cannot find these things. I know it's so small, but it would make my life so much better. And they had to change an ingredient. And I had one person at Wegmans explain to me at least why I couldn't get them. That was helpful customer service. I didn't like the answer, but at least I got an answer.
Right. So, yeah, you just wanted an answer and you wanted someone to take the time to spend giving you an answer. And, you were talking about mottos and mission, right? Wegmans, you walk into every Wegmans store and you will see it every day. You get our best, right? It's there. It's on your receipt. Every receipt, it says their mission. And I think that that's really important.
Yeah.
Great point.
I wish everybody's life motto was that. I think it also kind of goes back to personalization in that too, is that everybody's best every day is different at their threshold every day too. And I think that that's so important, especially in what we're all navigating right now in the United States. And the fact that, like, honestly, some days I wake up and I'm like, the best I have to give is remarkably different than the day before. And I think that that's something that is really essential in service excellence too. And I think it all kind of goes back to some of the themes I think I've picked up on in our conversation are personalization, emotional intelligence, understanding that empathy is really important. And I love that we never talked about it as a weakness, because I think that that's something that culturally needs to be unlearned right now. Empathy is a great gift. And I think bringing emotional intelligence, especially into higher education and service excellence, is so important. But what were some other key, I want to give our listeners some key takeaways they can take away from the conversation. Dr. Heath, what are some things that you really want people to take away from you being here?
I think that, again, customer service, it is individual. what works for 10 other customers may not exactly work for me. And if I could just get service providers to recognize that, I think that, we would all be much happier. I think that that's really important. I think it's also important that, if service providers stop giving customers what they think they need and instead ask them what they need. And if they can't provide that, have a conversation like, whoa, we had to change an ingredient. The cookies that you like are no longer available. I'm so sorry. Here are all these alternatives. I think that's where we need to go. And we have to think of customer service in more individual ways. And that is possible in education, even though it might be a little bit harder.
Lane, is there anything I was going to ask from the previous question about the customer service? I know you started talking about it, but as far as like takeaways from this conversation, I learned everything is learning, right? I learned several things that I'm going to take to my own life. Thank you, Dr. Heath, for helping me internalize some of those things, like even just in daily practice. But what was your key takeaway, Lane?
Interestingly enough, I know I referenced my toddlers at one point, but I think something, and maybe it's just a reframe, because we also talk about reframing societal norms and things like that, Dr. Heath. And I think reframing customer service, which to me feels outdated to my core for whatever, but thinking about service excellence feels more accessible. And the entire conversation that we were having, I realized I can apply it to my everyday life. Customer service, I'm like, ooh, like that's an arm's reach. I'm like, no, my kids are not my customer, or my husband's not my customer, or like my family or whatever. But I think service excellence is almost like something that you can apply in your everyday life in almost every situation, if not every situation. And I think that's my biggest takeaway is, like, for Marissa and I, we talked a lot about how we do this because we want to be of service and we love helping people. And I know that maybe I don't know it's a value of yours, Dr. Heath, but it's a value that we have felt from you personally that we really so appreciate and love about you. And I think that that's my biggest takeaway from this conversation. And I can't thank you enough for continuing to teach me and inspire me and love learning even more. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, fully agree. And the component with the culture of care that you had likened it to is that the caring piece, like I worry for when people hit the point of apathy, because at that point they no longer care and there's no reaching them. And that, Elaine, I really appreciate you touting. That's why we're doing what we're doing. I know that we can't necessarily speak for our listeners and what they're hoping to gain from this, and maybe some more communication and interaction will help with that. But we care. And so long as we care, we're going to do what we can because we care. But as part of our closeout, one of the questions we ask all of our guests is, what is one question you wish more people asked you?
I think the question might be, what can I do for you? And I say that, as a person who does customer service for a living, it's nice to be the one cared for sometimes. So, that's, what can I do for you?
I hope someone asks that to you today.
Yeah, I do too.
Thank you. I think that that's what all of us should ask, right? We should all get that. It shouldn't just be a once in a while thing. It should be an everyday thing.
That's a really good point. Are there places, whether on social media or elsewhere, LinkedIn, that our listeners could connect with you?
Yeah, I'd love it. LinkedIn, you can follow me on LinkedIn. It's just my name, Heath Boyce Pardee, EDD. TikTok, I'm getting better at TikTok. That's Dr. Heath BP. And then Instagram is at HBoyce Pardee. So you can find me in any of those places. And like I said, I'm trying to build up my TikTok. TikTok is hard, so I'm trying to work on that.
We haven't broached that space yet. We've been thinking about it and talking about it, but it seems a little intimidating to us. But we're gonna go for it, and we're gonna make sure to include all of that information for our listeners below. We post on YouTube and Spotify, so it'll be there for everybody to be able to access your content. Thank you so much again, Dr. Heath, for coming and again, being a learning mentor to us and continuing to inspire us and making a huge change in the world. I hope people go and follow your content because I am inspired daily by your care for others and the way that you provide service for others, not just in your career, but in your daily life. So I do hope people go and see how well you love others and support others. Truly touching. But thanks everyone for tuning in today. Stay tuned for our next guest on season 3 of Everything is Learning. And thank you again, Dr. Heath. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Much love.
Bye.
That's a wrap for this episode of Everything is Learning. If you loved this episode, share it, subscribe, and let's keep the conversation going.
Stay curious and keep learning.